Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Emil Kalinowski. This is Making Sense, a Eurodollar University production, and I'm joined by Jeff Snider, the head of global research for Alhambra Partners. This episode is going to be an important one. We are going to discuss a brand new, previously unknown, or very, what would the word be, not well publicized tool for you to measure if the monetary system is healthy, how it's making on. Because in the mainstream media, we're told stocks are up, everything's fine. But if you've been watching this show for any length of time, you know that the creation and destruction of money comes first, and then everything radiates from there. And Jeff recently wrote a two-part article, and this is going to be a two-part episode, where we are going to reveal this new measure that has been working for over a decade now that will help us determine how is the shadow system doing. Okay, Jeff, welcome to the show. Tell us about Niels Bohr and Werner Heisenberg. Who were they? How do they fit in?
They're both famous economists, I think.
Oh, how dare you impugn their character?
No, exactly. Yeah.
Sully their reputations.
That's probably the worst joke to start with. No, the eminent physicists from the earliest 20th century, both who helped develop quantum physics. Niels Bohr gave us first of all the working model of an atom, sort of the orbits that you're all taught with in high school. Well, Werner Heisenberg is probably most well known for his uncertainty principle, which is really where we're going today. In that what both of these guys knew, and along with Albert Einstein and a bunch of early physicists, was that a lot of what happens down on a fundamental, very elementary level, we can't observe. And in many ways, we can't even really comprehend. So we have to understand that, as Heisenberg formulated his uncertainty principle, that we need to realize and recognize that what we're looking at isn't really what we're looking at. We're looking at experiments, and we're seeing the results of experiments, and we can't draw necessarily hard and fast conclusions from those experiments alone. What Niels Bohr said, and what he got Heisenberg to admit and agree to, was what he called complementarity, which was essentially the idea that, look, we have these experiments, and they can tell us a little bit about little individual pieces of a system, but we have to be aware of the totality of the phenomena, which is how all of these experiments fit together and how we can piece everything together and create a comprehensive whole based on, again, understanding the limits of our own technology, the limits of our own understanding, the limits, maybe even the limits of human knowledge itself.
Or the human mind. I
Exactly.
forgot the name of the French polyglot, Henry Poincaré, and he's got that amazing quote, among many, is that, if I remember correctly, geometry is advantageous, or not true, that it's advantageous. I'm paraphrasing now, but basically that, it fits the human mind, and therefore we accept it, this way of looking at it, but that it doesn't necessarily have to be that way in reality. It's just how it's easy for the monkey brain to perceive. Well, speaking of monkeys, it's an easy segue to
right. We're
economists.
Perceiving, exactly. We're trying to perceive a reality that may be beyond our grasp to comprehend, and it's really in some sense it's a frightening realization, but in others it's very humbling, and it keeps us. We have to look at everything. We can't just narrow in on certain parts, because we have to remember that we are limited in what we can do.
Yeah, another one of his quotes that I found disturbing was that it's perfectly reasonable to think of the Earth spinning in the universe and the universe spinning around the Earth, but it's just we perceive that it's the Earth spinning, and that it's just advantageous for us to think of that way. But mathematically, I hope I'm not butchering it. Am I saying it right, Jeff? I'm stepping into your territory.
You've got the gist of it, which is, exactly that. We have to perceive what are utterly impressively complex systems, and we're really not wired to do that. We're really wired to do simple things, because that's how you survive. You survive very simply, and our perception of reality doesn't necessarily have to match up with reality. And even mathematics itself,
that's right,
has its own limitations, because it comes from our not to break out into some teleological argument here, but even the mathematics itself is a tool to help us perceive a reality. When Heisenberg and Niels Bohr and Albert Einstein said, it may just be on our limits. And math is really just our way of describing in our own sense of what we perceive.
Before the show started, I said I wasn't going to interject. I'm just going to go because we have so much to cover. But here I am interjecting again. And it's not just mathematics. I remember not just those individuals that you've mentioned, but Claude Shannon and, Turing as well. They also made the point that you needed these oracles. You needed these outside deciders as to what is true, that the system itself couldn't prove what's true. Eventually you need some outside force which is beyond our perception or ability to understand. Why is this factor? Why is this a constant? Okay.
Yeah, you're describing Russell's paradox, and we can go in a lot of different directions with that. And it's really true. It's like, how do we know objective reality when we're a part of that reality, right? We don't know there's no such thing as objectivity. And when we're segueing towards,
is there any way to
economics and money, I
don't know.
This is an utterly complex system. Going back to Adam Smith, his invisible hand was essentially an admission that we cannot directly observe what goes on in an economy. It's too complex. It's too granular to it's not like we can just total up every transaction that takes place and say this is what actually happens. We have to accept these limitations are not just in data terms, but in perception terms and everything else. And it's even more true nowadays with a monetary system that is completely left all traditional boundaries of conceptions of money and finance and things like that behind, where even mainstream textbooks and things still haven't caught up to where we were in the 1950s and 60s, let alone the 2000s and things like that. So we're really handicapped in how we can perceive this reality in economics more so than any other places. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that we just, mainstream economics is dominated in the sense that this is really simple. We just turn everything over to Alan Greenspan and the Federal Reserve. We don't care about the details. Therefore, we're not even going to develop the tools necessary to make decent observations. Our perception of reality is that it's all very simple, which is all very stupid.
Tools, observations, physicists use them, and so do economists and amateur YouTubers trying to understand the monetary system. And you give an example here of bank reserves. And so I suppose what our earlier discussion right now is, yes, this is an experiment that we're going to talk about, but we also have to keep in mind what we talked about earlier, that this is just one narrow slice looking through the keyhole, that there's so much more, that maybe all we can talk about is really just this experiment, and it doesn't apply to the broader system. Give us this experiment. You started out, we do this all the time in formalizing our understanding of bank reserves. For example, how do we describe them and their function? We get out our T diagrams. Tell us what goes on from there.
Yeah, the T diagram is nothing more than the simple. You have assets on the left-hand side, liabilities on the right-hand side. You have two counterparties. You got the central bank and whatever hypothetical bank. You simply do one single transaction where the central bank buys an asset from the bank and gives them bank reserves as it offsets. So essentially the asset swap. And that's really what we look at when we try to analyze bank reserves and say, well, what is a bank reserve transaction? What does quantitative easing or an LSAP transaction actually look like? And we break it down to what we think is its most elemental level, but yet when we do so, we forget about this is one transaction amidst an ocean of transactions, including many that are related, many that are related and offset by any number of other things. Again, going back to Niels Bohr complementarity, totality of the phenomena. Yeah, maybe that's strictly true on an elemental level, what happens in quantitative easing, that's the actual transaction, individual transaction, but it doesn't really tell us enough, or maybe even anything meaningful about what actually happens, or what's really going on in as far as the reality of the system.
Excellent point. And now you give another example. By the way, this article that I'm reading off of, the first part of the Quantum of Money, QE, Repo, and Niels Bohr, posted on the 1st of June 2021 at Alhambra Investments. We're going basically paragraph by paragraph. I highlighted everything except a couple of paragraphs. So now another example. Now we're going to talk about repo. Most people attempt to reconcile repo in this ceteris paribus sort of framework as a bank which wants to conduct a repo transaction, singular. And then you say already public perception is at a disadvantage because...
Yeah, when we think about buying a U.S. Treasury, for example, we think about how we would do it because our perception is that. And you show up to your broker, you have money in a money market fund, you have an account, a checking, whatever. You have the funds available. The broker executes the transaction, and you have a DVP transaction coming back, which means your cash goes out at the same time the Treasury comes in. That's how we perceive. You know, it's almost the same way as you would go into a grocery store and buy something. You present a form of payment and get something in return. But that's not really how it works. You know, it can be somewhat helpful to think about things in these elemental, these individual thought experiments. But I think in a lot of ways we do ourselves a disservice because we're thinking about them in a way that doesn't actually happen in real life. We're trying to perceive the basics of reality when reality is just because it's so much more complicated and nuanced. It almost is, again, I think we're doing ourselves a disservice because what really happens is that a bank or a financial system doesn't get out its checkbook and write a check for the Treasury note. It simply orders its, whatever desk or whatever part of the system, whatever part of the bank that's doing the transaction to go into the market and secure a Treasury. And what I mean, when we say buy, we have to be specific about what we're talking about there too, because we're talking about establishing full ownership and title over the asset where banks can acquire treasuries for other purposes where it doesn't necessarily need to establish full ownership over the asset. So we can acquire treasuries, limited rights usages in many different ways. So we have to be very careful about what we're talking about because it's so unlike what you or I are able to do. What banks get away with, or not really get away with, this is just standard practice the way it is and the way it has worked for a very long time.
There's so much to cover. I'm just trying to make sure that we touch on each of the points there. Here's an important line. In our simple example, the bank doesn't actually need any money whatsoever to come into possession of an asset. I think that's what we're going to be talking about a lot here in these next couple of examples is the ways it can get money without actually having money. But yes, to your point here also that there are many different forms of ownership and the bank knows or is what it's interested, which level of ownership. Okay then, so for a bank that wishes to establish title, definitely buy a treasury note. There needn't be any cash on hand at the start either. Okay, good, I'm glad we got to that. It's like you telling us that the universe is spinning around the Earth and not the Earth spinning within the universe. It all depends. Okay, so tell us, in the morning, it directs its market-making operation to go, and what happens next?
Well, it buys a treasury from a seller, usually another agent. And again, buy means establish full ownership title, so the seller agrees to relinquish ownership over the asset and transfer it. Now, immediately, the seller is credited with some form of cash, which is really, what, from the perspective of the treasury buyer, a daylight overdraft. It incurs a daylight overdraft, which means essentially a margin deduction from its whatever, if it has reserves at the beginning of the day, or whatever is going on in the interbank plumbing, so to speak. So essentially,
it doesn't send money right away.
No, it doesn't have to. In fact, it's essentially, if it's done on the Fedwire system, essentially the Federal Reserve's extending intraday credit, or in the triparty repo system, it's the triparty repo's custodian extending intraday credit.
The buyer got the money, the credit.
Yes,
the
seller
got the money.
The buyer
didn't put it up yet. Yes.
Right. But remember, the seller's doing a whole bunch of other things too. So, it's all of these things get jumbled together intraday, which is, again, when you're trying to put these together as a singular transaction, you're really doing yourself a disservice because there's all sorts of other things going on. But yeah, if we break it down into an individual transaction, by and large, what happens is banks will run intraday credits or daylight overdrafts, which are given to them by the custodian or the platform on which all of these things are taking place.
It used to be in the before the 90s, the Federal Reserve, right? The Federal
Almost
Reserve
exclusively, yes.
used to provide this daylight overdraft where they would send the credit to the seller and then turn back and look at the buyer at the end of the day and say, you owe me money.
Exactly.
But
so under that situation, you could see how the Fed would eventually. This Fed is the last in line here. They're the ones that's on the hook for if you don't pay for the transaction, the treasury you bought, you don't pay up at the end of the day. You then owe the Federal Reserve money, and the Federal Reserve has already credited the other account, so they've created a loan for you. So at the end of the day, the Fed is behind all of that stuff. And what they saw was that dealers, and especially in the repo market, were taking advantage of what was essentially a free form of intraday credit, and decided, well, are we really financing speculation here? Which, I mean, to a central bank, at least an old central bank, that was one thing you never wanted to do. You never wanted to finance speculation. So they decided they were going to start charging they were going to put position limits on. They were going to start charging for daylight overdrafts and all sorts of other things. And into that vacuum stepped J.P. Morgan and Bank of New York Mellon, who were at that time already large transactions and market custodians anyway. And they came up with this scheme called tri-party repo, where essentially they would perform the same sort of matching, financing, backstop services that the Federal Reserve had provided up until that point. So when you move over to the tri-party repo, the same thing happens. You buy the treasury without fronting any cash. You incur a daylight overdraft, only now the daylight overdraft is with J.P. Morgan mostly, or at least it was before 2008. And therefore, they're the ones that are eventually on the hook, which, of course, if you're thinking ahead toward 2007, 2008, now you understand why J.P. Morgan was at the center of so much of the turmoil and trouble that went on in the global financial crisis, because as tri-party repo custodian, not only were they incurring these daylight overdrafts, they had to know what was going on with all of these dealers that were doing the incurring in the first place, because the repo market was essentially their own created backyard. And they could see what was happening collateral-wise, who had collateral, what collateral was being pledged. And it wasn't just strictly on a one-for-one basis. It wasn't just one transaction, then another, then another. It was this ocean of, collateral colliding with cash and daylight overdrafts and settling up at the end of the day, and who can possibly owe it, liquidity profiles and all sorts of other complicated topics.
We're going to talk more about that in part 2 of this episode. But now our seller, who has a daylight overdraft with a tri-party custodian, has to provide cash. And you provide several examples of how that might be done.
Buyer, remember, it's the treasury buyer that's got the overdraft. I know it gets confusing really easily, and that's really why. No, and Emil, that's why we do the simple T diagrams, because if you don't, then that's where it's helpful. It's helpful to define our terms, but we got to remember, again, thinking back to Niels Bohr and Werner Heisenberg, that, okay, the totality of phenomena is not those T diagrams. That's just to help you define and illustrate the concept and the terms. But what actually happens, it gets real complicated real fast.
So how does this transaction get funded? You give us several examples. It could be funded by a scheduled incoming intrabank payment from another counterparty. So they're counting on someone else to give them cash so they can pass it along.
Yeah,
or
right.
Maybe,
and think about it that way. You know that a payment's coming in, so you're going to invest that money before it shows up. And that's typical practice too. I mean, yeah, I know you think we roll our eyes, but that's standard practice. That's the way it works. And so, that's one way to do it. You've got a certain number of outgoing payments and a certain number of incoming payments, and you leave yourself a little bit of margin for unpredictable events that happen. But if your outgoing payments are less than the incoming payments, you've got excess liquidity. And so at the end of the day, I'm going to have this excess liquidity, so you're going to have the treasury that you're going to invest that excess liquidity in lined up before the excess liquidity shows up. And that's just a bank being efficient.
Yes. Another way they could pay a collateral swap. What is that?
Essentially, you brought in a treasury, which means that you've established title over a treasury. You could swap it out with another form that you've already, another type of security which you've already arranged in some other transaction, which essentially allows you to get into a bunch of other transactions that eventually bring cash back into the picture.
And another option, a short sale.
Exactly, right?
They could sell, get the cash, and then use that to pass it along. Although
Right.
eventually now there's another liability eventually because they borrowed that. But okay. So, okay, good. So those are examples of how they could raise the funds.
And then the main example, which we're getting to, is just repo. You've bought the treasury. You haven't put up any cash for it. You've incurred a daylight overdraft. And so at the end of the day, again, if we're thinking about this as an individual transaction, at the end of the day, you got to square yourself with JP Morgan. JP Morgan has already credited the seller's account, and therefore he's going to knock on your door and say, look, it's 5 o'clock, it's 5:15's approaching, you got to have cash in the account. So what you do is you go into the repo market, you contact, JP Morgan as tri-party repo custodian already knows what's going on. They arrange for you to find repo financing. In the repo market, you do a repo transaction where the funds are presented in collateralized or secured by the collateral that you've just obtained full title over. So at the end of the day, you start out by buying a treasury with no cash. Then you, at the end of the day, square everything by going into repo and borrowing the funds to do it. So you buy first, borrow later.
And now the twist, which is where we're going to in part 2. We were just looking at this as an individual transaction, but as you say, but even that's not really a thing, because this isn't really much closer to what must be shadow money really either. Banks run entire portfolios of securities and assets and liabilities. This is not just one item. It's, as you said earlier, pools, assets, oceans that they're weighing. And that's where we're going to turn to in part 2. Is there anything that we didn't cover in part 1 that you wanted to bring up?
No, I think it's just keep in mind the fact that that's where we're going here. Looking at these things in very simple ways, like we're doing, breaking them down by individual transaction, has a very limited usage for us. It can help us, again, define our terms about what's actually taking place, but it doesn't describe reality. It just describes a stylized example, which has a very limited use for understanding what really goes on. And of course, what we're really trying to understand is the implications where all of these things come together.
And at the end of this part 2 episode, we're going to see a new measure of the monetary shadows.